what do you think you're doing?
Keeping the British end up, sir. Mr. Bond!
Born the son of a police officer on October 14th, 1927, almost 100 years ago, Roger Moore would go on to portray James Bond as the third actor in the role. Previously, he had been in a successful TV series called The Saint from 1962 to 1969, which he also had co-produced and directed many of the episodes, and it is an absolute great TV show. If you've never seen it, check it out. You can see it on YouTube. Then he would also work with Tony Curtis, that is Jamie Lee Curtis's father, in a TV show called The Persuaders in the early 70s. Finally, when Sean Connery decided that he was finished with the role after Diamonds Are Forever, even though it was financially successful, was definitely not the greatest and ushered in the camp era of the Bond franchise. With Roger Moore coming in 1973, we usher in the Roger Moore era of the campy Bonds. We're going to count them down. This is Greg here, and I want to welcome you back to my 20th episode of Midnight at the Movies. Let's do this with number 7, Moonraker. 1979's Moonraker is a movie that is possibly the pinnacle of cheese in the Bond franchise, but not necessarily in a way that succeeds at what it set out to do. Those who are more familiar with Ian Fleming's novels will probably notice the name Moonraker as one of the original Bond novels, but there is absolutely no resemblance to that novel's story. Possibly the worst aspect of this movie is the villain. A Bond villain is just as, if not almost more important than Bond himself. Sure, there's plenty of Bond villains with destroy the world plots, but Drax's plot to destroy humanity and live in a space station is so cartoonish in its execution that it only serves to make me roll my eyes and laugh. Moonraker's plot is generally meandering and slow-paced, but it can sometimes have scenes which are fun for how silly they are. Kind of like the laser gun fight in space that goes on for too long, but due to the fact it ends up being amusing in its own way, the goofiness of it often borders on self-parody in a way that actually reminds me a lot of the Austin Powers movie that was making fun of it in the first place. Speaking of which, I do have to admit this movie gave the Austin Powers films a lot of good material to make fun of. Despite all of that I have said so far, Moonraker does at least start off fairly strong with an unironically fun opening sequence, a set piece that manages to capture the same spirit as a modern Mission Impossible movie. The music continues to be consistently iconic and great, and the Bond girl of this movie, Holly Goodhead, is actually one of the stronger examples from the Roger Moore era, and I appreciate how she plays a more active role in the story. She's more of an equal partner to Bond, and they both work undercover to investigate the villain's organization. Her character is original to the movie, no surprise there, but I gotta give credit to the movie for managing to nail the main heroine. It also is worth giving praise to the special effects of this movie. For its time, and despite the budgetary limitations, there were quite a lot of generally good-looking effects. In fact, the space shuttle models and shots of space and the tricks to simulate the illusion of zero gravity are quite convincing. All in all, the campiness of Moonraker manages to make it at least an amusing watch. I certainly wouldn't consider it the worst Bond movie of all time, but it's definitely right there in the bottom tier and one of the weakest of the Moore Bond films, obviously, because this thing has dropped in last place. So now is the time to score the movie. This one here is gonna get a 4.0 out of 10. Disappointing, and really that's mainly to do with the back half of the film. Unfortunately, it's a product of its times and has not aged well like a jug of old milk. So let's move on to number 6, coming up right now. Incidentally, both the sixth film to star Roger Moore as James Bond and also number 6 on my list in the countdown. This is a movie that proves to be a fairly mixed experience, despite this film having plenty of positive points to it, particularly regarding the Bond girl, Octopussy. Ultimately, still, it ends up being a pretty formulaic chapter in the franchise, though one that doesn't feel like it's a waste of time. I do want to give some good marks for the creative and engaging aerial stunts in the fun and impressive pre-titles sequence and opening set piece, which is an overall major highlight of enjoyment and one of Roger Moore's best. Whenever the movie has action, it proves to be pretty electrifying, and the entertainment they provide manages to be one of the things I remember most fondly of this movie. The climax of the film, it also does a great job creating tension. The nuke countdown on the train succeeds in hanging a suspenseful time limit over the heads of the characters in what I consider to be one of the movie's biggest tropes, the countdown. With lavish locations from India to West Germany, back when Germany was still split in two, this film has a fair number of pretty silly elements that really hurt my ability to take the story too seriously. Which, I mean, Roger Moore never really took the role too seriously either. But there's moments like Bond swinging on a vine like he's Tarzan. There's another moment later on when he dresses up like a clown, which, I mean, I understand the reasoning why they thought this would work, considering he's infiltrating a circus. But I think that in hindsight, they could have picked a better character than a clown. I don't know, it just kind of was silly. You know, the villain of a movie, like I always say, is very important to me. And if the villain sucks, the movie sucks, usually. The villains Orlov and Kamal Khan are not what I consider to be interesting or intimidating, despite one being an insane megalomaniac Soviet general that wants to disarm the Allied powers with the threat of nuclear war on Europe.
Follow that car.
And the other being a suave Afghan prince in exile who acts as his co-conspirator. Neither of them stand out much compared to the many far more impactful villains in the franchise. The actress, Maud Adams, and her chemistry with Roger Moore is absolutely just in tune. I think the two make a good match, and she is probably, arguably the best Bond girl match for Roger Moore as far as character goes, and I find her character's unique position in the story to be the most interesting thing about the movie. The dynamic she shares with Bond and Octopussy's role in the story is truly memorable, and something I wish the Bond franchise would try doing more often. Yeah, that's right, Octopussy has come in 6th place in my ratings, and I'll tell you right now, it's going to take a big jump in score from the previous entry, Moonraker, because I'm giving this one a 6.0. It's a good movie, it's well worth a watch, and it's, there's a lot of good parts to it. It's not perfect, it's definitely not one of the best Bonds ever made, it's far from being one of the worst. So, moving on to number 5, we're going to jump right into some voodoo magic and some strange things with some heroin dealing going on with Dr. Kananga / Mr. Big with Live and Let Die.
Uptown. You headed into Harlem, man.
Well, you just keep on the tail of that jukebox, and there's an extra 20 in it for you.
Hey, man. For $20, I'll take you to a Ku Klux Klan cookout.
With Daniel Craig and Pierce Brosnan, it would seem their first time at bat was a home run. But with Roger Moore, in my opinion, that is not the case, and it will be several movies before he has hit his stride. Albeit, number 5 on this list, Live and Let Die, is, to be honest, another middle-of-the-road entry to the series. I was torn between this film and Octopussy in their respective positions in this list. Again, guys, this is my list, and I ask you, what is your favorite Roger Moore Bond film? And of course, stay tuned to find out what mine is. One of the positive things I really like about this movie is its amazing opening title song, Live and Let Die, performed by Paul McCartney and Wings, has got to be one of the most remembered James Bond theme songs out there. There are a handful of other songs that come to mind. We'll catch them as we go along in the countdown, but I will say that is one of the reasons why people remember this movie the most, is from this iconic song.
Live and let die.
And to be frank, I enjoyed the stunts, the boat chase was amazing, and the pacing of Live and Let Die is pretty damn good. But then it gets hampered by the ridiculous finale And I will also point out that the relationship between Bond and Rosie Carver was well done, enjoyable, and perhaps she is more worthy of being the Bond girl in this movie. We also get the sheriff that has to have influenced Smokey and the Bandit.
Regular Ben Hur down here, doing 95 minimum. Need any help, J.W.? Hell no!
Apology accepted. No.
We also get some great editing and some beautiful photography. The shots look amazing, and Roger is still young enough to be right for the role, and I think it's a shame that his better material came later in his time as Bond, and that his older age is the main detractor in those films. But on the other side of this double-edged sword, we get what I would describe as perhaps one of the worst Bond villains in the Roger Moore tenure.
Somehow I never thought of you as a poor loser. I was hoping you would join me to a drink to the future.
With this dual identity that Kananga portrays, as he is also Mr. Big, and his fortuitous organization just fails to deliver any sort of suspense and mainly just creates a lot of eye-rolling.
But then you go and steal this valuable young lady from my good friend Dr. Kananga.
Well, possession being 9 points of the law, I would say Kananga is your problem, huh? Thank you.
And yes, Kananga / Mr. Big is definitely going to be the worst villain in the entire Roger Moore era. So there's a lot of things that pull this movie down in the chart for me. However, it did beat out Octopussy, even though both movies to me are neck and neck for, equal. I had a hard time deciding which one was going to be number 5 and number 6. But ultimately, Live and Let Die inched out. It's still going to get a score, and that score is going to be a 6.0. It's the same score as Octopussy. Both movies are equally as enjoyable as each other, but let's move on. Number 4, you're probably wondering, why is this number 4? Well, stick around and let's talk about it, and you'll find out. Yes, it's better than you remember. The Man with the Golden Gun.
What do you know about a man called Scaramanga, 007?
Scaramanga? Oh, yes. The man with the golden gun. Born in a circus, father the ringmaster, possibly Cuban, mother English, a snake charmer.
From the opening line of the theme song,
He has a powerful weapon.
The Man with the Golden Gun is an entendre-laden chapter of the, at the time, seemingly tired Bond series. Released soon after Moore's premiere with Live and Let Die, this movie came at a time where people were still coming down from the high of his last film. I consider it pretty underrated, but not for any particular reason. There are simply just a lot of good points to it that I appreciate, which I don't normally see highlighted by other fans of the series. I'd first like to highlight that this movie is one that broke new ground on the technical side of things. The amazing record-breaking car stunt performed in one take by Lauren Bumps Willert comes to mind. It was the first stunt planned and tested using computer simulations. Though as much as I love it, it is unfortunately hampered by the silly sliding whistle sound effect that was used in the scene for no particular reason other than what I think might have been a poor attempt at injecting comedy where it doesn't belong. Well-paced and solidly written plot that follows Bond as he seeks the Solex agitator, a component that can potentially solve Britain's, albeit the world's, energy crisis. This quest ends up pitting Bond against the famed assassin Scaramanga, the namesake of this movie. It may seem weak to solely rely on a plot device, a MacGuffin, to drive it, but the theme of the energy crisis is one that was very relevant at the time. Interestingly, and perhaps one of the reasons for this movie's lackluster reception, the story of Golden Gun plays lightly with what Moore's Bond films have tended to be known for, out-of-place comedy aside. The movie derives some traits from kung fu cinema, featuring a lot of martial arts action for a Bond movie, and even being set mainly in Asian locations such as Hong Kong and Thailand. Speaking of locations, another part of this movie I appreciate is the RMS Queen Elizabeth, a real ocean liner being used as the setting for the MI6 headquarters Bond visits. The people behind making the sets did a fantastic job creating a faithful and very creative replica of the interior, complete with slanted angles galore. Another strong point of this film, perhaps the strongest, is the villain. Golden Gun might have gotten mixed reception when it came out, but even amongst the movie's biggest critics, the one point they couldn't find fault was in Scaramanga. Played by the late Christopher Lee, Francisco Scaramanga is like an antithesis to James Bond. The duality between them is inarguably the strongest point of the movie, and it shows. A lot of it is thanks to Lee, who was very well cast for this role, and while I personally feel as if he had held back slightly, he still manages to be an iconic antagonist. That's right, and Christopher Lee has been in some of the biggest franchises in the last 50 years. He's been in the Star Wars prequels, he was in the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and also James Bond's nemesis in The Man with the Golden Gun. And now it's time to go ahead and give this movie a score. I'm going to give this one a 6.5. That's right, it's getting a little bit extra than Octopussy and Live and Let Die. All three movies are evenly playing, but I'm going to give this one a little extra because I like it a little bit more than those two. And yes, I think this one is definitely worth 4th place. But now it's time to get into the top 3, and we're going to go into the top 3 with a Bond movie that I've loved since it came out. It's a guilty pleasure. Let's get into this one, A View to a Kill. A View to a Kill, number 3. Number 3 on my list is the 7th and final of Roger Moore's Bond films. This is another fairly underrated Bond movie, having also had a mixed reception when it was released, often considered as Moore's weakest outing, rivaling that of Golden Gun. I beg to differ. Roger Moore was 57 by this point. His age is extremely noticeable in the film, and it is probably the widely criticized part of the movie by audiences and critics when it came out and to this day. A prime example of the well-executed campiness would be the opening sequence, Bond being pursued down a snowy mountain by Soviet agents, while skiing and eventually snowboarding. I don't think it's the campiest thing I've seen in a Bond movie, do you? I don't think so. Let's talk about that. But I will say this is the first time that anyone really got to see snowboarding in any kind of movie, and it definitely has drawn mainstream attention to what became a new sport. I'd like to briefly highlight the music. It's notable how the group behind the opening theme, Duran Duran, worked directly with the film's composer, John Barry, in creating it. Due to his involvement, there's a subtle synergy between the theme and the rest of the movie's score that is likely to be overlooked by most viewers. However, I really think that this song, being the only #1 song so far on the charts, is the best James Bond theme song out of every film that has been made.
Excuse me, aren't you?
Bond, Simon Le Bon.
The final showdown between Bond and Max Zorin, the villain of this movie, is one of the most standout moments of the story, taking place atop the Golden Gate Bridge. Yes, I know the special effects haven't aged that well with a lot of green screen. However, the whole premise is amazing, and I really would love to see something like that done in a modern way. I will point out that one of the weak points of this movie is the Bond girl, and Stacey Sutton is definitely one of the worst Bond girls that Roger Moore had to deal with. She's very squeamish, I will say. Speaking of the villain, as I always do, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about him. Played by the incredibly talented Christopher Walken, Max Zorin is probably my favorite of the Moore era. Summing things up, I really enjoy this movie. It may not be the favorite of critics, it's certainly got a special place in my heart. I remember when it first came out, I was really young. It wasn't one that I got to see in theaters, unfortunately, but it definitely made an impact when I finally saw it. I think another part of is the mixed reception can be attributed to the campiness. Sometimes it takes away from the experience, sure, but A View to a Kill flies in the opposite direction of the hit-and-miss nature of the camp in his other movies. It is one of the best examples that you can find across all of Moore's Bond era. And of course, as I conclude with The View to a Kill score coming into play, let me tell you, this movie is way better than I think people remember. Yes, there's a lot of moments in here that are a little cringy, but ultimately I decided I'm going to go ahead and give A View to a Kill a 7. That's right, you heard that right. I'm giving this movie a 7.0. I think this is a good movie. It's better than people remember, and at the time, yes, the only big really downside to it is Roger Moore was a little bit long in the tooth. We're getting into number 2, the runner-up, and this is going to give it away. It is the most serious one he did, and the movie has aged very well, and I think it's a great watch. Number 2, For Your Eyes Only.
You left this with Ferrara, I believe. Have no head for heights.
So the number 2 pick for the Roger Moore James Bond countdown is going to be For Your Eyes Only. I have to say, I really think this is one of the best James Bond movies of the 80s, because here's the thing. At the end of The Spy Who Loved Me, which everybody has now guessed is number 1, it promised us this film would be the follow-up, but instead we get Moonraker because they wanted to capitalize on the success of Star Wars and the whole sci-fi craze that was going on in the late 70s. Other films came out also, like Star Trek the Motion Picture, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, all these different sci-fi films. So, of course, the Bond guys have got to do something similar. So out comes Moonraker, and as we already know, is the worst, at least in my opinion, Bond film that Roger Moore did. There's some good scenes in here, some good action. It's not an overly done film, but as far as action goes, it's a lot more plot heavy. I really like the simplicity of the story. I do, and really found it I found it very amusing at the very beginning when they do a little nod to Blofeld. They don't say who it is, but we all know who they're talking about when they drop him down to the chimney. Very, very fun. And they do a little nod to Tracy, James Bond's deceased wife, from On Her Majesty's Secret Service, which we'll get to that one in the future when we do the well, I'm still trying to figure that out. But anyhow, so, as a deliberate attempt to, quote, get back to basics, as the film's writer Michael G. Wilson had put it, Moonraker had pushed things way too far to the extreme, and so now the only feasible direction to go is with a more grounded approach. You know, the story of For Your Eyes Only is seemingly straightforward, but has more twists and ambiguity to its villains than you'd expect from a Bond movie with more in it. Bond finds himself tied within the web of a Cold War thriller. Moving on, I cannot stress enough that good villains are always essential to a good Bond movie. What's interesting is that there's a shift in who we see as our antagonists in For Your Eyes Only. We get Aristotle Christados, played by Julian Glover, who is the true villain of the movie, but you don't know that until later on. I appreciate how our expectation was initially set against Milos Colombo, another smuggler, but it's later revealed the true mastermind the whole time was Christados, who is leading Bond on a wild goose chase. It's cool to have a villain who manages to hide his true intentions and trick Bond like this. Julian Glover was a great pick for the role, and the twist is creative and unique. Yet another way in which this movie goes for something more grounded, and I love it. Speaking of things I love, Melina Havelock, played by Carol Bouquet, is one of my favorite Bond girls. Havelock is a very active character in the story who is driven by a fiery revenge that is portrayed so authentically that it was as if I could feel it through the screen. This movie is like fine wine. You know, with age, its flavor only becomes more savory. Oh yeah, so, like I said, For Your Eyes Only is definitely aging like a fine wine. Go ahead and top that off a little bit with my... Yeah, so, just kidding. So yes, For Your Eyes Only, we're going to score this movie. Definitely going to make this one an 8.5. I love this movie. It's a great Bond film. Yeah, that's probably a higher score than most people would give this one. But it's worth it. I really think this is a good movie, and of course that just means there's only one more film left in the Roger Moore filmography and his James Bond films.
Can you swim?
Here we are, unsurprisingly, The Spy Who Loved Me is at the peak of this list, and of course, it's because it's at the peak of Moore's outings as Bond. The Spy Who Loved Me had to take the top spot. The film is Moore's most iconic portrayal of the character, one that to me checks off all of the Bond trope boxes. First and foremost, the opening sequence. Not only is it possibly the most exciting of Moore's films, but it has solidified itself as one of the most iconic Bond scenes of all time. Equally as unforgettable is the theme song of this movie, the fittingly named Nobody Does It Better, performed by Carly Simon. Additionally, on the topic of music, the film's score is awesome, adopting a unique and catchy disco vibe. Spy's story is one that tells a classic plot of a megalomaniac, Carl Stromberg, planning to destroy the world and rebuild human society underwater. On the topic of characters, a strong highlight of the movie is the Bond girl, a very strong iteration this time around with Anya Amasova, played by Barbara Bach, an agent of the KGB, also hunting down Stromberg. Her and Bond both have the same goals throughout the film, but though their rivalry form a special bond, she vows revenge for Bond killing her lover at the beginning of the movie. Will that play out?
I will kill you.
The action in this film is top-notch for its time and has the right amount of over-the-top campiness that is the staple of any solid Bond film. I love the chase scene between the Lotus Esprit and the helicopter in particular. The idea of a tanker eating submarines is fanciful, but, it gives it that dash of reality that makes it believable. The Spy Who Loved Me isn't entirely perfect. There are a few little nitpicks I do have. For example, the movie does slow down a little bit when they're in Egypt. Anyway, in closing, I just want to say that this movie obviously tops everyone's list of all Roger Moore's Bonds, including mine, and I'm going to go ahead and score this movie right now as a 9.0. This is a great movie. So in closing, I have to say that The Spy Who Loved Me definitely deserves a toast. Everybody seems to rank it as number one, not just myself. I will say that the only thing that I kind of wish they would do is make Bond movies like this and more. Again, and bring it down a little bit, make them a little less serious. I think, the next James Bond needs to take a little bit of Roger Moore, a good helping of Pierce Brosnan, a lot of, Daniel Craig, put them all together and mix them together, and let's get something that's a little bit of each, something modern, but a little campy, because I have to say that's what makes a James Bond movie a lot more fun. So next time on Midnight at the Movies, we're going to do the top 5 video game movies of all time, the George Lazenby James Bond film countdown, because it's his turn next. It's going to be a short list, I promise you. So stay tuned for that video. If you think my videos are getting better, click that like button and just shoot me a quick like and let me know that I'm doing the right thing and I am going in the right direction so that you and I can connect better. And I really appreciate it so much. I'll see you guys next time on Midnight at the Movies.
You amuse me, Mr. Bond.
Well, it's not mutual. I'll be back.
I am your father.
Gentlemen, I have a plan. Oh, hell, let's just do what we always do. Hijack some nuclear weapons and hold the world hostage.